y'all hear me? Oh, wonderful. This is a wonderful crowd, and I'm so glad y'all have come out to see us. If you get a chance to, please say hi to the UF students that are sitting in the back, right there. They're really excited to be here. We drove 15 hours to be here, and we're so happy that y'all came out and that we get to see you. I did want to introduce our panelists. So first, I'd like to introduce Jody Allen. She received her PhD in American History from the College of William and Mary in 2007. She specializes in African American history and is currently researching the impact of the 1902 Constitutional Convention and the enactment of the Civil Rights and Voting Rights Acts of 1964 and 1965 on race relations in Hanover County, Virginia. In addition, she has co-written a lesson plan for the National Park Service's Teaching with Historic Places website, based on the 1968 Green versus New Kent County, Virginia school desegregation case, and it's one that our interns have been learning about as well. She and a colleague have also received 2 grants from the Virginia Foundation for the Humanities to develop a documentary on the Green case and an article on the forced migration of African Americans in the Encyclopedia of Appalachia is forthcoming. She's taught the second half of the U.S. History Survey and the Introduction to African American History. She is currently a visiting assistant professor in the Lyon G. Tyler Department of History at the College of William and Mary. John LOHMAN is the director of the Virginia Folklife Program and the Virginia Foundation at the Virginia Foundation of Humanities, and the Virginia Foundation of Humanities. Okay. As the state, when I read it, I was like, As the state folklorist, he works to document, present, and support Virginia's rich cultural folkways through a variety of media, including audio and video documentation, exhibit design, public programming, and project development. He has produced numerous bluegrass, old-time, and gospel releases for Virginia folklife recordings. He has presented at numerous festivals, including the Smithsonian Folklife Festival, the National Folklife Festival, Merle Fest, the Blue Ridge Folklife Festival, the American Folk Festival, and others. John has published scholarly popular writings on such topics as Mardi Gras, murals and memorial walls, duck decoy carving, and Southern folklore. And word on the street is that he's an amazing musician. Charlie McGovern will be our first speaker tonight. He's the program director of the American Studies Department at the College of William and Mary. He was educated at Swarthmore and Harvard. His interests include modern American history, 20th century popular culture, popular music, the culture of American capitalism, especially consumerism, formations of American nationalism and transnationalism, citizenship, race and ethnicity, American media, oral history, and modern material culture. He has written Sold American Consumption and Citizenship, 1890 to 1945. He has written essays on the politics of folk and popular culture, the electric guitar, Woody Guthrie, advertising, and other subjects. Before coming to William & Mary in 2003, he was a curator of American culture at the National Museum of American History Smithsonian Institution, where he curated or co-curated exhibits, most notably rock and soul, Social Crossroads. And this is your childhood, Charlie Brown, Children and American Culture, 1945 to 1970. And y'all know Dave Brown, Dr. Dave Brown, I'm imagining pretty well at this point, but I'll go ahead and introduce him briefly. Dave Brown received his BA in Anthropology from the College of William and Mary in 1996 and his MA in Historical Archaeology from UMass Boston in 2001. And he also received his doctorate from William and Mary in 2014. His research interests include the rise and fall of the plantation system in the New World, the interaction of Native and colonial cultures in the 17th century, and African-American tenant farmers in 19th and 20th century Virginia. In addition, you all know this, he is co-director of the Fairfield Foundation, Incorporated, a nonprofit archaeological and history research group in Gloucester, Virginia, as well as a founding member of the Werowocomico Research Group, currently studying the site of Werowocomico, the principal residence of the Virginia Algonquian Chief Powhatan from 1607 to 1609. And I would also like to thank our sponsors from Mathews and Middlesex County and UF as well. This wouldn't have been possible without you, and we really mean that. And I would like to welcome you all to our version of Rediscovering History in Mathews County and Middlesex County. Thank you so much.
See if I can do this without damaging anything. I told Jessica I'm much happier if I can stand and walk around and flap my arms. Can you all hear me? All right, so if I won't use the mic, is that going to be okay on the... mighty fine. Okay, I'll start the phone so I know what time it is. Setting, no, oh, there we go. I got a clock. All right, I'm good. Thank you for your kindness. Thank you. I have nothing in particular that I can share with you about Mathews and this part of the world that you all know so well. And Jessica told me that it was okay if that was the case. So, to atone for that, I'd like to start out with a story. This is a story that is not an actual piece of folklore in the way that folklorists understand it. But the story is many decades old at this point. I learned it as a young person and told it as a young person. Fortunately for you, in those days, I used to do it with a guitar, and I didn't inflict that on you. But I'll tell it now as an older person. I thought of it a few years ago, and it has a lot of different meaning to me now. It's a written story, and it's copyrighted, so that means it's real. Copyright gives us our identity in today's world, doesn't it? It's a story about what happened to me back on the East Coast a few years ago. Like everybody, I was trying to make a buck. I'm not a storyteller either, so I beg your indulgence. I was trying to make a buck like everybody else. But times got hard. You all know what that's like. And my luck ran out, and I got down. And I got tired of roaming and bumming around. And finally, I thought maybe the best thing for me to do would be to get a job and settle down. So I found myself hitchhiking back to my old hometown. Made quite a few miles in the first few days. Figured I'd be home in a week if my luck held out this way. But you know, it was the third night out, and I got stranded. And it was out at a cold, lonely crossroads. It was raining, it was cold. Not like tonight, except rainier and colder and lonelier and crossroadier. I was hungry, I was freezing, I caught myself a chill. It was just about that time that I saw the lights of a semi top the hill. Should have seen me smile when the air brakes come on. And I ran and climbed up into the cab where I knew it would be warm. At the wheel sat a big man. Must have weighed 210. He stuck out a big beefy hand and he said with a grin, "Big Joe's the name. This here rig's called Phantom 309. I asked him why he called his rig such a name. He said, "My son, don't you know that this here rig be putting them all to shame? There isn't a driver on this here line or any other son that's seen nothing but the taillights of Big Joe and Phantom 309. So we rolled and we talked the better part of the night. I told Joe my story. He told me his. Smoked up his viceroys all along the way. The last time he thought of viceroys. And almost mysteriously, well, it was the lights of a truck stop come into sight. And Joe turned to me and said, "I'm sorry, son, this is as far as you go. You see, I got to be making a road, turn up the road a piece." But I'll be damned. He tossed me a dime as he threw her in low, and he said, "You go on in there, son, and get yourself a cup of hot coffee on old Big Joe." Let me tell you, when Joe and his rig pulled off in the night, I just blinked, and they were out of sight. So I walked into the stop, shook myself off. Walked into the stop, sat down and ordered up a cup. Said, "Big Joe set me up." Got very quiet all of a sudden in that place. got so quiet. You could hear a pin drop like it was a jackhammer on a 10-penny nail. The waiter's face turned kind of pale. I said, "What's the matter? Did I say something wrong?" I kind of said with a grin. He said, "No, son. It happens every now and then. You see, son, every driver in here is a friend of Big Joe. I'm going to tell you what happened 10 years ago. Yeah, it was 10 years ago, out at that cold, lonely crossroads where you flagged Joe down. There was a whole busload of kids, and they were coming from school, and they were stranded in the middle when Joe topped the hill. And they could have been slaughtered, except Joe turned his wheels and jackknifed. And then a long skid. Folks around here, of course, only know Joe gave his life to save that bunch of kids. Yeah, I was out at that cold, lonely crossroads. They say it was the end of the line for Big Joe and Phantom 309. But you know, it's funny. It's funny, son, every now and then, on a night like tonight, when the moon's holding water, and it's cold and windy and wet, why they say old Joe will stop and give you a ride. It's like you. Some poor hitchhiker will be caught, stranded, thumbing a ride. So here, son, here's another cup of coffee. It's on the house. I want you to hang on to that dime. Keep the dime, son, as a souvenir. A souvenir of Big Joe. And Phantom 309. And that's the story. It's copyrighted to a man named Tommy Hill. Tommy Hill was a songwriter. He was married to Goldie Hill. Those of you country music fans might have known Goldie Hill from the 1950s and 60s. She was married to Carl Smith, who you also might know if you're a country music fan like I am. And it was sung, or talked, recited, I guess, back in the day by another singer named Red Sovine. So it's a perfectly traceable piece of evidence. You can go to the Library of Congress and look up the copyright. You can find a recording. You might even be able to find a piece of sheet music that Tommy Hill submitted to the Library of Congress to make sure he got paid. But the reason I'm telling the story tonight, the reason I tell it to my graduate students, it's not because I want to kill 5 minutes. It's because I want them to understand something that I've learned in a few decades living. And why that story came back to me, I suppose, as an adult. When I was a young person, I sang it because it was cool. It's that, of course, our actions, our presences on this earth have consequences. And those consequences are sometimes very easy to see, and other times not so much. We're kind of like blind gardeners in a way. We plant and water, but we can't see. You can smell, maybe. Certainly you do enough gardening after a while, you do smell. But it's okay to laugh at those, you know. It's not, I mean, don't kill yourself. But. These things have consequences. What we do in this world, we leave marks. We leave marks, a word, a gesture, a thought, an action. It leaves a mark in the minute. It leaves a mark in time. It leaves a mark in space. And it leaves marks across time, across space. And even across a lifespan and after the grave. You all know your community. If people are fortunate, they know the community they live in. Even driving down here, I could see buildings that once were something else, clearly, even to my relatively uneducated eye for those things. Folks of you who've been here for many years will remember things that were something else before they are what they are now. You, of course, remember people. You remember figures in the community. In my business of history and American studies, people yak and yammer and argue endlessly over what constitutes the proper way to do X, Y, and Z. How to write history, how to tell history, what are the sources that are important, what are the questions that are important. Are we united, are we divided? We're united and divided. What do we make of that? Are we a country, or are we merely a bunch of regions that are groping to be something more? When are we going to get over stuff that happened in the past? Can we get over stuff that happened in the past? Endless debates. I take no sides at this moment. Scratch me at a different moment, I'll be on all sides of any given question. I like to think that's the side of an open mind, but maybe that's just the side of an idiot. I'm not sure. You have to ask my students about that. History, though, those stories that we tell ourselves about who we are, what happened, why something happened, and the things, of course, we forget. Sometimes we forget them because they're painful to us or to one another. Sometimes we suppress stuff because we really don't want to live with it. We have to get by. Another day comes. The bill is due. And that's true for our society as well as for individuals. I'm not denying any of this. It's serious work, this business of living. But we tell ourselves stories to make that living a little bit more tolerable at times when we're struggling. We tell ourselves stories to remind us maybe there's an alternative. Big Joe is a little phony ghost story. There are plenty of real ghost stories around, so to speak. But why would we tell a ghost story? We might tell a ghost story to remind ourselves that things matter. The grave can hold the body, but it can't hold the spirit. Why is our culture now, why do young people talk about zombie apocalypse as if it was the World Series? We are now obsessed with the undead. That's not because everybody wants to walk around like this. It's not because everybody loved Scooby-Doo when they were growing up, although lots of people did. It might have something to do with people really questioning the boundaries between really living and not living, between being present in the moment and not. I don't know, but somebody's going to write a great dissertation and a great book on that someday. History tells us. We make history, We make history, and it tells us what mattered to us, why it's important to remember. And a lot of times, why it's important to remember is just to simply say, we were here. We did something. We struggled. We overcame something. We suffered. We tried to make a little bit better in the world, whether that world is the people across the street, the town, the country, the nation. History is not just kings. It's not just wars. History is what we all do with one another every day. And wherever we were taught how to behave in the world, the church, the school, the parlor, the playground, the workplace, wherever we were taught, we carry those values with us in our behaviors. How am I doing? A couple minutes? Okay. We carry those values with us. So it makes a difference. Because sometimes we will not be able to face something. Knowing what the elders face helps. I want to end with a different story. This is a story that comes right from my research, so to speak. I was fortunate enough to spend time with a great pianist named Charles Brown, who had lots of hits in the 1940s and 50s. He was based on the west coast of Los Angeles, but he originally came from Texas. And Charles went to Prairie View A&M, where he majored in chemistry. But he wanted to be a blues pianist. He sounded a little bit like Nat Cole. I'm drifting and drifting like a ship out on the sea. And he was a gambler, and he spent every dollar he had at the track. But back in the day, he wore neckties. He was a stylish man and a popular musician. And when I met him, he came to the Smithsonian to play with his band, and they needed somebody to ferry them around for a weekend, and so I got that job as curator of popular culture. That was something I was so glad to do. And then I visited him a couple of times in California, where inevitably, I didn't just sit there with a tape recorder. I wound up taking Charles to the doctor, and another time he was in the hospital, and so I just visited him there, and I just sat and talked to him and bathed him and took care of him because there was no nurse. And so I did all the things a nurse would do, and I'm like, I don't know this man, but he needs this, and so, that's what you do. And he told me a story. It happened during World War II. He had just come out of Prairie View, and he got a job in the Midwest in a munitions factory. As a chemist, he actually had a lot of knowledge. But he was, of course, he was a black man in a place that wasn't used to very many black men. One day his boss said to him, Charles, take lunch early, go on outside. And Charles protested and said, well, no, I'm not done with my assignment yet. And he said, that's all right, I'll finish it up for you, go on outside. Charles said to me, 10 minutes after I went outside, there was an explosion. Someone had sabotaged my workspace. And my boss gave his life for me. And then he said, never forgot that. I visited his family many times. And sometimes every night when I play, I remember him. And he's part of the blues I sing. And he winked at me and said, now there's a little history for you. And I think about that. I think about that on a good day. I think about that on a day when I've had one meeting too many. You all have had that day. One thing too many. Your knuckles are dragging. You're at a 45-degree angle. It's like, get me out of here and just have me lay down someplace. I think about it on days when no matter what I do, it's wrong. And I can be really good at being wrong. I think about that on days, in other words, when I would rather be or do anything but me. And I remember that as a historian, part of my job is to think about what other people had to deal with. And if I can remember and honor and pass that on, not only is Charles's work still going on, but we remember that we owe something to the past and we owe something to the future. Historians are terrible at predicting the past, let alone the future. You can give me the document and I'm still going to have trouble with it. But the reason we go back to these stories is because they give us the wisdom to move forward. And we're always going to fight and argue and worry about which stories are the most important. We wouldn't be the various group of humans that we are were it otherwise. But as long as we remember, as long as we make it our business to talk to and respect everybody, we have to make our own judgments, but if we hear out everybody and think about everybody, we will go a long way toward honoring the spirits of fictional people like Big Joe and real people like Charles Brown. Thank you.
Hello, and thank you, Jessica, and everyone else. I won't remember everybody's name, but for inviting me and giving me this opportunity to talk about doing oral history. I have to say, and this is in no way at all Jessica's responsibility, but you know, one of the things I learned tonight is that you have to pay attention to what's online about you. And I haven't updated my CV, I haven't updated my bio since before I graduated. So, and I only say that because it really doesn't matter to me. No, it's not you, it's me. That's why. But the only reason I say that is now I actually run something at William & Mary called the LOHMAN Project. And I think that's a main reason it's why I'm here, is to talk about the LOHMAN Project. And it's not in my old bio. But in 2000, just to give you a little bit of background, in 2007, when the state of Virginia apologized for slavery, a group of students at William & Mary the student government passed a resolution saying that William & Mary needed to look at its history regarding slavery, publish that history, and then build a monument to the enslaved workforce. The next year, the faculty assembly passed a similar resolution. And so as timing sometimes really matters. And so the time was right. And so Bob Ings was brought in. He was a historian from the University of Pennsylvania. He was brought to campus to see what we already knew, what kind of records were already there, maybe what chapters had been written in dissertations or theses over the years. And so he came to campus, spent a semester, wrote a report to the Board of Visitors, and the Board of Visitors passed a resolution acknowledging that the College of William & Mary had owned slaves. And in addition to that, that the college had not done anything to challenge the legal segregation, or what we call now Jim Crow. And they established something called the LOHMAN Project at that point in time. And LOHMAN was a man who was once owned by the college. And he was selected because we knew the most about him at the time. We know that the college, he sometimes sold produce to the college, which was not that unusual in some, especially urban areas. The college gave him a bonus one year. We don't know exactly why. The college bought him medicine. And then in 1817, the college bought a coffin for LOHMAN. And so because we knew the most about him, we chose to name the project after him. And so I became I'm now the co-chair and managing director of the LOHMAN Project. And one of the bigger pieces of the project is to conduct the research to finish the history of the college, a history that includes the African-American labor force that was there from the very beginning, the people who made the bricks that now stand as at least part of the Wren building. The Wren building burned down 3 times, but some of the original bricks are still there. One of the things, we spend a lot of time in archives, looking through the papers and trying to piece together this puzzle. But in terms of the 20th century history of the college, we've begun an oral history project. And that has been really kind of amazing. I've had a lot of opportunities through my dissertation and working on Greene versus New Kent, and then some work in Buckingham. I've had some opportunities to do a lot of oral histories, and I love them because in some ways I have to remind myself, you're not sitting talking to your grandmother. But that was something I loved to do as a child, was just sit and talk to my grandmother and listen. And I think it helps me now when I'm interviewing people in the community. And oral histories have not always been greatly respected in the historical community. They were considered, because memory is such a iffy kind of thing. I mean, I don't remember what I wore last week, on any given day. I'm not sure what I had for lunch today. I hope I'm not the only person in here who has, you just remember things differently. And sometimes what you remember today, a week from now changes. Okay. I look at, I swear, to my husband, I say, you could never be interviewed for an oral history because you never remember anything correctly. When the truth is, I may be the one misremembering. I don't know, but it's just, but so that's how memory is. But there's this belief that, oral histories were never, a valid way of telling history. But one thing, I want to ask you all, when you think about the history, say, that we knew in the late 19th, early 20th century, what were those histories based on? What kind of sources were they based on typically?
Oral.
I'm sorry?
It was oral. Written.
Written. They were more written. Any specific type of writing you might think of? Journals, diaries, letters, account books, court records. But that meant that only the people who were literate could have their story told. Okay. Also, another thing I like to ask my students, people like Thomas Jefferson, George Washington, all those famous people, they knew they were writing for a future public, and so sometimes you censor yourself, or you have someone censor you after you're gone. I have a friend she says one person knows where all of her journals are, and she used to get to her house and burn them before anybody else can see them, So we think about what people will think about us in the future. And when I'll ask my students, okay, say, you're 18, 21 in college, you're having a good time, maybe not doing anything completely illegal, but maybe a little on the wild side on the weekends. And you decide to keep a journal. You want to remember what you did at William and Mary, what fun you had. Now, 20 years from now, when your child is getting ready to go to college, are you going to hand them that journal? Probably not. Or you're going to take some pages out of it. Okay. We all edit ourselves. So those wonderful sources that were taken as the God's truth from George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, Benjamin Franklin. Notice I'm saying all men too. They're not any better necessarily than any other source. Every source has to be, what word do I want to use? Dealt with or interrogated. Thank you. My friend from William and Mary. And every source has to be interrogated. So while there are certainly weaknesses to oral histories, there are weaknesses to those diaries that we decided were so important all those years ago. One of the things that oral histories will do for us is that they open up an entirely new potential set of stories from people who couldn't write, who didn't write for whatever reason. So we now can find out what their lives were like, and we and we have opportunities also to do that kind of interrogating that we need to do with everything. And I'll share a story. A man who actually was at William and Mary during the late 60s and early 70s as a graduate student. And there were very few, the first 3 African-American undergraduates who were allowed to actually live on campus, 3 women, came to William and Mary in 1967. And every year a few more came. And so this man that we interviewed was saying, he noticed that as he was meeting undergraduates, they were unhappy. They weren't having a good experience. And so he and another graduate student, along with some of the undergrads, decided that they were going to do something to make a change on campus. And so while I was interviewing him, he shared with me at the time, William and Mary, whenever at football games, whenever there was a touchdown, they would play Dixie, and that the Confederate flag flew over the stadium, and there was a fraternity called there is still a fraternity called Kappa Alpha, which has an annual event every year where they dress up in the Confederate uniforms and kind of the days of old with the hoop skirts and everything, and they would march through the streets. And I know, a lot of, it's kind of maybe that flag is in the eye of the beholder, but there are a lot of people who they see that flag and they see it being waved by a Klansman during the Civil Rights Movement. They see, so you can't help how people, whether you mean it for evil or not, you can't help how people have experienced that particular piece of cloth. So what he did, he decided that as a subtle protest, he was usually the only African American in his classes. He said he got a flag that was about the size of a handkerchief. And he said periodically, whether or not I had to blow my nose or not, I would pull it out and blow my nose. And that was his speaking out against what he felt was an oppressive atmosphere on campus. A bigger thing that he and actually one of his white classmates did was, and they were never caught for this, but they stole the KA's flag off their flagpole, but the biggest thing was they heard the Citadel was coming to play at William and Mary, and they thought this will be a good time to make a statement. So every time they play Dixie, we're going to burn a Confederate flag. Well, if you can imagine, if the Citadel had come and that had happened, it would have been quite a mess. Well, the administration found out about it, and they decided that before any flags could be burned, they were going to stop playing Dixie at the games. And so and he said I think every state police officer in Virginia was on campus that day, but nothing happened because, and I asked, we had a volunteer who had a retired professor who said she wanted to get involved. And so I said, well, I got a couple stories I want you to check out for me and see what you can find. And she did find the evidence of what had happened, everything but the stolen flag. And because he wasn't caught, it wasn't in the record. But everything else she was able to track down. So you see, we had these stories, and now we have evidence that they actually happened. And so again, when I think of using oral histories, I think that if we did not value talking to individuals and getting their stories, those are great stories we would not have about the College of William and Mary and how things grudgingly but persistently changed over the years. So I will, because I forgot to set my timer, but I'm at 15 minutes. So I will stop and turn it over to the next person. But thank you very much for your attention.
Okay, I'll give it. We're just rapid fire on you. I guess we'll do questions afterwards. Is that what you're thinking? Okay. My name is John LOHMAN, and I am the Virginia State Folklorist. I know you all are dying to know who your state folklorist was. That title is very, always raises an eye. It's always popular at cocktail parties and things like that. Most people have no idea what that is. And it was a very funny thing that I was able to speak at a conference in Peru one time, talking to them about traditional arts, intellectual property issues with traditional arts, how to preserve them potentially, how to how they fit into things like tourism and these types of stuff. And in translation, this actually happened through different things. I came out as a state forklift operator. I'm very proud of. But I always get a kick out of, like on a W-9 form when they say profession writing folklorist, and people always say, "Oh, you're a storyteller." Is that usually the first thing? So you're a storyteller. And I'm not a storyteller, although in many ways I suppose I am a storyteller because I'm constantly telling stories. I'm not telling jack tales and the kinds of things I think they mean when they say that. Folk and folklore, folk life is in some ways kind of an unfortunate word for what we do. Every year I go to the American Folklore Society meetings, and ever since I've been in the field as a grad student and as a professional, there's always at least several panels on we've got to change our name. How we got to change our name of our field. For one thing, folk, the term folk, is a very loaded term. And who is the folk exactly? When the American Folklore Society was formed, right at the turn of the century, they defined the folk as African Americans, Native Americans, and Appalachian Americans. Those were the people who were the folk, and they were the people. And the folk has always had an interesting thing. On the one hand, it's sort of people who are somehow haven't been touched by modernity, by modern life. They kind of live in this other, and in other ways, they're really revered as kind of like the soul of the people, So it's interesting. In practice, for example, I guess it was the weekend before last. I'll explain what I do in a minute, but part of what we do is we really try to support and present, as well as document traditional arts, traditional ways of life in Virginia. So I was doing that at the Richmond Folk Festival. And often when people hear folk festival, their first thought is Peter, Paul, and Mary, that kind of thing, from the folk revival. And we have to explain that we're talking about something different. When we're talking about folk life, what we're talking about, whether it's folk music or folk arts or food, or we're talking about those ways in which over the course of everyday life we express either consciously or unconsciously, this is who I am, or maybe a better way to put it would be this is who we are, because we're really talking about a connection to a particular community. And as you know, we are simultaneously part of many different communities. So it could be an occupational community. I'm a coal miner. That's a community that I'm a part of, and we have our own expressions, our own ways of doing things. Or it could be I'm Irish. This kind of thing. Or I'm from Mathews County. And this is part of the community that I'm a part of. So folk life really speaks to those things, and like I said, they can be very conscious. Just Friday night I was in Arlington, Virginia, with a group of Bolivians, including many who are involved in these Bolivian dance groups, which is unbelievable. You wouldn't believe hundreds of these dance troupes, and they all do something different. And in that case, it's a very conscious thing when they talk about it. They're like, this is when I feel, this is how I communicate both to outsiders as well as how we do it to each other. We're Bolivian. This is, we are being Bolivian right now, and they say that, and soccer leagues are actually, to them, the two most important things for keeping their sense of identity, which gets to the next thing, I think, unfortunate thing about the term folklore, which is, in popular use, you'd say, well, this isn't, like you were talking about, written in, well, that's just the folklore, right? Like a horrible term is like old wives' tale, all the folk, that's not real. That's like this, that's the folklore. And that's not how we look at it. We often see the greatest truth in these things. But also there's an inherent kind of idea of, it's nice, it's not that important, so that like if you watch the news, you have all the real news, and then at the end they always stick a little folk thing at you. You know, that's so it's kind of a so the idea. In fact, a gentleman was a great Brian Sutton Smith, who's a folklorist, who was a professor at Penn, where I studied folklore, called it the triviality barrier of our field. You know, it's kind of like, well, it's nice, you know, baskets are nice, and, you know, fried apple pies are nice, and, you know, dance is nice, but it's not, music is wonderful, great, you know, Charles Brown, that's cool, but it's not that important, you know, it's not. Yeah, exactly. And what I can tell you with absolute conviction is often that's about as far from the truth as you possibly can, that these things are really at the heart of people's identity. You know, it's the reason they go to work, you know, is to do this. Because at night they're in a garage, you know, working on a hot rod car. You know, that's their thing, you know. So I wanted to, you know, as the director of the Virginia Folklife Program, which is part of the Virginia Foundation for the Humanities, we call ourselves the State Center for the documentation, the presentation, the celebration and support of Virginia's rich folkways in all of their manifestations. And so we're talking about the music that we play, the stories we tell one another, the food we cook, the crafts we create, the work we do. You know, it's very the vernacular architecture that we live in. You know, all of these things. It's a big topic. And Virginia is a very, very large state, as you may or may not know. There are, if you looked at a map, I know Florida's a big state too. If you looked at a map of the United States and you looked at, there are points in Virginia that are west of Detroit, for example. I don't know if you knew that. And then, of course, you have the Eastern Shore, which is in the eastern parts of the United States. And then you have, you know, the Washington, D.C. metropolitan area, which is one of my most diverse places on earth, honestly. I mean, and then you have the Central Piedmont, you have South Side. You know, so it's a huge state, actually. You could drive all day, as I have, and never leave the place. And there's basically one of me. You're more or less looking at the Virginia Folklife Program. I've you know, in all our majesty here, the royal we. I have had some opportunities, as I have right now, to at times get a grant, hire somebody to do various things. Right now, I have somebody called the digital media specialist, is what I've called this job, and it's golden. Just somebody who can operate all this equipment. You know, for me, it's like if I don't leave it on the hood of the car, I feel good about it, and he's just incredible. But anyway, because of this, I try to get around the state quite a bit, and as you know, it takes time too. In any community, it can't just be a drive-by when you're doing oral history, when you're trying to learn about a culture and really get into it. So it's not just like, okay, check that place off the list. So for many years, a lot of my focus was in Southwest Virginia. That's kind of where, you know, you just start uncovering, you know. But I have had a chance to do and to have contact with a lot of folks from around the Chesapeake Bay. And I know we're supposed to tell a story about Chesapeake Bay. One of the programs that I started when I've been in the job now for going on 14 years, when I started the position, the program had been in a hiatus for quite a while. So really, I was starting it from scratch. And I kind of came in and they, you know, God bless the director of the foundation. I'm sort of like, well, what am I supposed to do? You know, and he's kind of like, you tell me, you know, it's your program, which is wonderful, also a little daunting. I drove around the state, and I would just talk to anyone I could, you know, just people, you know, just tradition bearers of all different types. And a theme that kept coming up was, we are concerned that this is going to die out. What we're doing is not going to continue. Or that what I do, you know, this thing that I do is going to go with me, you know. So that became a real theme, which is so much of what I think we're talking about when we talk about oral history, is capturing these stories before they disappear with the person who holds these stories. So one of the very first things I did was I wrote a grant to start an apprenticeship program, which we talked about when I came in. where we pair masters and apprentices in the widest variety of things you can think of. For a year, we got funding from the NEA to do it. Please support the NEA; they're wonderful to carry these things on. So through this, I've gotten to know a lot of people. What's been really neat about it is when you go into a community and you actually have something to offer. So it's not just like, okay, I'm going to come here and I'm going to hang out with you and stay around you, and then I'm going to interview you and I'm going to take pictures and then I'm going to write an article in a journal. See you later. But when you can actually say, for example, we can offer you these apprenticeships that comes with a stipend and these kinds of things. It's wonderful. It feels really good. And often that opens all these doors to community. So my first experience with Chesapeake Bay area, if we want to call it that, was actually on the Eastern Shore with a decoy carver. His name is Grayson Chesser. He lives in Accomack County. If you're familiar with the Eastern Shore, he's almost at the Maryland state line, west of sort of where Chincoteague Island would be, a place called Saxis. And he runs, he and his wife own something called the Holden Creek Gun Club. And he's a goose guide. He's a hunter. And he carves decoys. And for full disclosure, I grew up in New York. I grew up in outside of New York City, Westchester County, New York. I grew up in a household, very suburban kind of environment. Jewish, non-religious Jewish household, I guess I would describe it. Jews from Westchester are not known for their hunting prowess in the world. I've never shot a gun, for example. So it's kind of like, oh God, is this this guy's he's gonna find me out? I'm just a fraud. I just started, and a beautiful relationship started. My son's name is Grayson. I named him after Grayson, as well as Grayson County, Virginia. I'm just looking. It's very strange. I was just looking at this. We got married at his house. The young woman who's playing the fiddle played the music at our wedding, and Reverend Paschal from the Paschal Brothers a cappella gospel quartet from the Hampton Roads area married us. So it's like, wow, it kind of speaks to the depth of these relationships that actually get formed. But I just want to quickly, I'm running out of time, I just want to quickly tell you a little story about meeting Grayson. And he had an apprentice in decoy carving. That's actually how I came into contact with him, was through the apprentice in this case, who said, he lived on the shore. He was a come here. There's the from heres and the come heres. I imagine you have that situation perhaps around here. And Grayson was a from here, which, I think 7 generations there. And he's a full-on waterman. And, we're talking about oral history. It's interesting, we, with the foundation, we get grants all the time, including for a program like this. And, the question often comes up and is debated, sort of insider, outsider. Can an outsider come and do this work? Is it better to have an insider, somebody from the community do it? What are the, what kinds of things, is somebody who really knows about it do the questions, or somebody who knows nothing about it do the questions? And I think there's real positives and negatives to both, and there's something to be said for an outsider. For somebody said, hey, what is this? Kind of thing. And so so part of what we do, as I said, is documentation is very important to us. So we, a photographer who's an old friend of mine at the time, we get to go out to all the masters and apprentices and spend time with them and document what they do. So we got to go hunting with Grayson and his apprentice. And the thing I should say about decoys, which is interesting, is decoys at one time, Chincoteague Island, and then some of the barrier islands that people no longer live in, Cobb Island, Hog Island. This was a real hotbed, real center for decoys, for duck decoy carving. And some of the greatest carvers, the Cobb brothers, the Ward brothers, if you know anything about decoys, very prized decoys now, came from these areas. But when Grayson was young, and this was late 50s, early 60s, none of his peers were into this at all. You find this often the case, and then plastics were coming in, And one thing I've learned a little bit about hunting, although I still haven't shot a gun, but I've learned a little bit about waterfowl hunting. And one of them is that ducks actually do not see very well. I don't know if you know this. You know, that ducks, that even though these decoy carvers spend an amazing amount of time making these ducks so that you'll look at it and you think you're looking at a duck, you know, that actually you could take a plastic milk jug, paint it brown, put it in the water, and it's going to be about as effective, right? So when you have classes coming in, very few people were into this in his generation. And, you know, Wade Grayson puts it, he said, all his friends wanted to be Johnny Unitas, and he wanted to be Miles Hancock, and he wanted to be the Ward brothers. He took an interest in this. And there's an interesting metaphor, I think, that I think of as sometimes traditions are like an hour, you know, sort of an hourglass shape is what I think of it is. You know, you see this with like a fiddle tune, which is you look historically, and there's one time where everybody knows this fiddle tune. And then time passes, and less and less and less people know this fiddle tune. And sometimes it's like an hourglass. It gets to maybe one grain of sand, maybe one individual. And if you can capture it, if you can conduct an oral history that captures it, or video or documentation, or somebody is interested in learning it, you know, often what you'll find is suddenly more and more and more people, and there you go. It's back, you know. And I think Grayson is kind of one of those people. And decoy carving became later a very prized folk art. For a long time, it was not. It totally utilitarian. And Grayson's decoys are still utilitarian, and he makes a very big point of that. He says, you know, he says about 75% of the ducks that he carves end up directly on a shelf. They don't go, they're not used, but he always makes them to be used. And, you know, we didn't realize what this hunting trip involved. We were woken up at 3 a.m. and sat down to one of the most epic meals of my life at that time. This breakfast that had, you know, ham and this and crab soup and crab cakes, and it was unbelievable that his wife, they kind of are a team, and this is a big thing. And there were these guys from Texas who they were entertaining, who viewed Grayson as a god, you know, get to hunt with Grayson Chesser. We went out, and in the back of a pickup truck, along with the dogs, were hundreds and hundreds of these decoys, you know, just in there, you know, just, you know, it was like, kind of blows your mind when you know that these are such prized pieces of art, you know, just in the back of the truck. Then we drove God knows where, and then eventually got in a boat. All this stuff got in a boat, and we're wearing, I never wore camouflage before, but we're in like layers of it. I mean, it's and you know, duck season is like, it's like now almost, you know, it's like the worst, like the weather we had today is like perfect. Duck hunting, nasty, you know, and you know, we're out there and everything, and you know, we had been told like there's just a lot of doing nothing, you know, you kind of sit and wait. So you know, we were just gonna snap some pictures. We didn't have a gun, Morgan and I. They told us we just sort of have this blind, you know. We had. It's crazy to think about in retrospect. We had on our trips, we often, because we had a small budget, we often would stay, and this is before, you know, now I mostly know people, which is great. But at the time, you get this little room, usually has one bed, and so what we got into the habit of doing was playing Scrabble for the bed. Whoever won the Scrabble would get to sleep in the bed. So we brought our Scrabble board out there. I mean, that's literally, you know, the kind of day we thought we were going to have. You know, we're going to relax, we're going to hunt, we're going to take some pictures. And it was, I mean, you just lie there in this, like, wet. Have you all duck hunted before anymore? No? Where are we? Come here? What's going on? It's just like this. Oh, God, it's the worst. It's just freezing cold. You can't move. You know, if you move, you mess the whole thing up, you know, because they're waiting, you know, and you don't want to. Oh, and I forgot to mention this, which is one of the most important parts, which is he sets up, he calls it his rig, which is all the ducks, and he really takes it seriously. He says he wants it to look like a party. You know, basically what's happening is the ducks will come, they'll see all these ducks in the water and think, oh, they're all eating, and they come, you know. And to see, I got to tell you, the one thing about this, to see the sunrise with hundreds of these amazing work of arts floating in the marsh. It was unbelievable. Worth this whole trip. But finally, I just, and these guys just lie in their own little thing, and they just wait. They just wait. And it was not a good day for hunting. No ducks were coming. And at one point, I just said, Grayson, I'm so sorry. I need to walk around because I couldn't feel my feet anymore. And, finally, they broke for lunch. I mean, it was just a bad day. They were about ready to give up. And we're having lunch and soggy little sandwiches. And all of a sudden, there were these ducks, these brant is the duck. It's like a Nordic Canadian duck. Started flying. And Grayson he didn't have, there's duck calls, but he just did this. Like, rah, I can't even imitate it. And it was like a cartoon. I mean, it was like these ducks like stopped in the air, and it was sort of on, but I was going to say, and this kind of reminded me of what you were talking about. I'll leave you with this because I think I'm running over time now. Is that you were sort of talking away about why these stories are told over and over again. Why is this fascination with zombies or your story that I've heard many times too. So I think sometimes when we look at these things, these folklore. And the importance of it is sometimes, I sort of almost see it as an expression of a world view. I've gotten to know Grayson very well, and, they live this life. When you go, we love going to their house, because when we do, it's just like, it's like there's none of this, they don't do the cell phones, they don't have the internet, they don't go to fast food restaurants, they don't, they make everything, it's just this really, this wonderful life, and when I look at the art of a decoy, and I've watched him make them many times now, what I think is really interesting about it is, he starts with a block of wood, and the art is in there already, right? And it's made by what you remove from it, in a sense. It's sort of like, here's a block of wood, and you take this away, and the joke, we have a guitar maker, Wayne Henderson, I work with, and people ask him, how do you make these great guitars? He says, well, I get a good pocket knife, good sharp pocket knife and some other tools. And he says, and then I cut away everything that doesn't look like a guitar. And there's your guitar. And that's kind of what this is, and it made me realize, like, God, this art that he does is, kind of perfect metaphor for the way they live their life in many ways. It's like, your life is not, the art is not what you add, what you put in, all these things that we always have to have, all this stuff. It's actually what you don't mess with, So I could go on, but this is the kind of work that we do. I was going to show our website, but I won't do that. Instead, I'll leave you all with a pamphlet that has our website. I encourage you to go to it. We have a wonderful, lots of video and audio, and lets you know what's going on around the state, all kinds of things on it. And we encourage you to, we've done a lot of apprenticeships around here, Northern Neck Shanty singers, you may know. We've worked with several oyster men in Reedville. Your famous oyster shuckers from just down the road here, Deborah Pratt, is a longtime friend. We worked with them. Now this year, the Holmes brothers, thanks to Besida here, have entered our program, taken on apprentices. So, and there's others. So we run around here and we're looking for things, looking for people and stories to help tell, but also help hopefully support and capture and celebrate. That's the other thing. We're not shy about that. A lot of academics I know that I used to go is like, well, that's no, we're about that. We like honoring people and celebrating people and lifting up what they do. That somebody who does this traditional folk craft, should be spoken about in the same sentence as the ballet dancer or the of these other high arts. We don't go for that. So I'll leave you there. Okay, thank you.
So I was talking to Jody before this started and was really optimistic that I wouldn't have to go first because she and I were both really nervous about this. And So we were very grateful for Charlie to go ahead and kind of break the ice a little, get all y'all set up for the rest of us. And then I realized it would have been better if I tried to go first, because it's a little hard to follow these guys. And, you know, somewhat local boy would like to make good, so be kind. Those of you who have heard this story before, hopefully you can bear with me. Those of you who haven't, try. I don't know. We'll see what you think. A good friend of mine, many years ago, which is a difficult thing for me to say, having been the young person in the room in many an historical society meeting and other places for a long time. He went ahead and he sat us down one day and told us a very short story. A short story that I'd say is probably my favorite story to tell, and not just because I seem to tell it all of the time. I deal with a plantation called Fairfield, or at least that we call Fairfield. Myself, Thane Harpole, for those of you who know Thane, give him credit as well for perpetuating this. But our friend Colonel Ray Page went ahead and told us this story that was passed on to him from his father, who was about 10 years old when it happens. And he's a wonderful family that had, I guess you call them late births, or, you know, basically very old parents, very long lives, and children not necessarily at the beginning of them either. Well, he said his grandfather and his father, his grandfather was the sheriff, came up to Fairfield in 1897. And what we now know is the spring rather than the fall, something that we were able to confirm because that stickler of historical documentation eventually comes in and ruins everything, at least the best of the oral histories that teach us lessons. Well, his grandfather's father walked up to the front porch of this house, and tied to the front porch was a chicken. They walked up into the front room, and we know the house well enough now. It was either to the left or to the right. There were two front rooms. They walk in, and sitting there on a piano stool is an African-American woman. Next to her is, and I butcher this part of the story every time, it's a stack of corn cobs, but none of the corn's on it anymore. So they've all been husked. They've all been, you know, it's basically all the stuff you would normally throw away. And she's taking this and she's feeding it into the fire to stay warm. So perfect idea, perfect use. Everybody says, okay, I got this story so far. I'm following you. So she's sitting on that piano stool, and next to her is a piano. And tied to that piano is another chicken. And that's it. Nothing else. The entire story. Disappointed? Yes, and it is in fact my favorite story, because it's like this little gift. Because when you're teaching kids about history, and you're teaching kids about material culture, and you're teaching kids about the understudied aspects of the past, you want to find a way to engage them with a little bit of everything. You want the battles, you want the dead rich white men, you want the presidents, you want the heroic aspects of it, you want the comedy, you want the music, you want everything that would engage people, that would give them some kind of connection, some kind of empathy. And as an archaeologist, as training, although I seem to have branched out and I do a few other things these days, you want them to connect also with the everyday. You want them to take a fine-tooth comb to every last detail, but you don't want them to lose sight of the bigger picture of things. And having a little story like this ends up becoming just the perfect example. It's not going to rewrite history. It's not going to tell them, oh, okay, and then that's why we don't invade Russia in the winter. You know, it's not going to solve that. It definitely doesn't put food on the table. It doesn't tell us about these things in any great way. But what it does tell us is it tells us about the importance of all of these connections. So I usually ask the kids when I'm talking to them about this, or the parents, or the adults like yourself. I don't discriminate. These stories we basically approach in the same way with any audience, no matter their age group or region or anything like that. And we ask them to take that little story apart And normally I go with some Q&A, so I'll ask you something that you find interesting about that description, and I'll ask you why he might be wrong or might be right, or what he might be missing. You know, the questions like, why would you have a chicken tied to your front porch? You know, and it's funny to see because everybody brings their own experiences to the table. They say, okay, well, it's obviously because you don't want the chicken to run away. Some people say, well, it's a guard chicken, obviously. It's to protect your house. Eventually, some of them get around to thinking, okay, well, maybe it's a bug zapper. And for those of us children of the 70s, 80s, and 90s, we still remember the zzz that you would hear on calm nights when, for some reason, your suburban parents or neighbors went ahead and turned off their air conditioning for once. I mean, my history is a history of an Air Force brat who grew up in suburbia. So, you know, I kind of latch on to other people's histories. I embrace them. I get welcomed, luckily, into a lot of communities that embrace me. And so these little elements help refocus things, see them at different levels. And when they go into the archaeological world, they're able to see things a little differently. Somebody picks up a nail, and they're not thinking of it just as a nail anymore. So when the more we the more I think about the story, the more I'm reminded about how much utility it has in everyday life. So we start to think about the stories that we tell ourselves. We took our... Nobody notices. I can make mine go off if it makes you feel any better. And then I can get everybody excited. This is where I bring sympathy into me, is that my wife is about a month away from having our second son, so I can just claim, this could be it. Oh, and she really would like it to be. She's kind of sick and tired. 8 months of pregnancy, some of you know what it's like. I don't. I'm a guy. All right, okay, so I've gotten over the awkward moment. Back to the story. So as kind of this awkward oral historian, somebody who's seen the value of talking about these kind of things in public and seen the way that it will inspire people to think of things in different ways. We have all of these different routes you can take down that road. You can engage with people based on their interests, but you can also kind of pick those stories that you feel are most important and kind of impose them and hit people over the head with them over and over again, depending on how you feel. So as an educator, as an oral historian, there's the danger sometimes of kind of putting yourself in the position of instructing others and forcing a new history on them, which is both powerful and intoxicating, but also something that's very dangerous. So most people I know who deal with oral histories, you have to be prepared ahead of time that they're going to be a little reserved. They're going to be very careful about not wanting to kind of force themselves on to what you're thinking. They have studied and know very well the mistakes of the past when it comes to taking interviews and understanding the context and the dangers. And really, this is just a reflection of time. You know, oral histories will be taken for 30 years to come, for 50 years to come, for 100 years to come. And a lot of what our oral histories will be, much like this story, much like the documents we read in the archaeology that I interpret, is going to be a reflection as much of us as it is about anything in the past. When I ask those kids why the sheriff goes up to the front door of an African-American woman's house, you know, at that point they see the slide I forgot to bring, which is this magnificent manor house built in 1694, which was quite possibly one of the largest brick manor houses in all of the colony at that time, but it's 1897 now. So you have this symbol of perhaps, you know, the greatest power and wealth of the colonial period, and it's being lived in by, at the very least, one African-American woman, possibly her family, but at the very least just one woman. And they see that contrast. They see what they know, often very little, of the Jim Crow era, of the postbellum society, the period that follows the Civil War, and they see a sheriff walking up that front door. And they lose context, or they don't know context, or they don't know how to ask about context. They don't know that he lives next door, that it's not a sheriff serving a warrant, or maybe it is. It is, in fact, something that's missing from the entire story. Maybe they're just there to buy eggs. Maybe they have other relationships. It's where we dream about historical documentation giving us a little bit more so that we can tell a more complete story. And at the same time, there's a part of me that hopes that we never quite get there. Because for us, it's become about the search. It's become about trying to find the name of this African-American woman sitting on the porch, knowing full well that we'll likely never know her name. But all of the other information that we learn, all of the lessons in our own lives we learn as we get through this search. And ultimately, for us, it's also about understanding the power of oral history when you become the perpetuators of that oral history. And that connection back to Ray Page and the responsibility that we have as we try to pass that on to next generations. So Ray Page, luckily for us, was able to give, was it 2 different interviews? Yeah. Jessica did 2 interviews with Ray Page before he passed away. And so the meaning of that and the ability to pass it on is something you have to always remember is one of the responsibilities that we have to tell the story and to record it. And then you let it go. Thank you.
So, Jennifer? Hi, I'm Jennifer. I just wanted to tell you guys about, I'm an intern or former intern at the Oral History Program at the University of Florida. I wanted to tell you about 2 events that we're having here this weekend, right here at the Mathews County Library. So on Friday from 9 to 12, we're having Share Your Story. So if you come on by, we will be happy to talk to you and hear all about your stories. And then on Saturday from 10 to 2, we're going to have an oral history workshop where myself, Diana, Jessica, and Raina are going to be teaching you guys and talking to you guys a little bit more about oral history. So if you guys just happen to be here, come by and say hi. And, you know, if you weren't going to happen to be here, maybe you should.
We have about 7 minutes for questions. So we have a microphone if you'd like to use it. But if you had any questions, I can see hands because I'm standing.
I think that mic needs to be turned on.
Yes, ma'am.
You gotta do the Phil Donahue and run up and down.
I can do that. I can be that person.
Can you see how to turn it on?
Hello? No.
On the side, Jeff.
I got it. You got it. Hello? No. Hello? Hello? Is that better? Does anyone have any questions?
Okay, I guess this is for John.
Charlie.
Charlie, I'm sorry. Okay, why do you tell a story that's not true? I mean, there may be a reason, and I can kind of go along with it, but I'm looking for truth.
Sure, but when you start asking and digging into what true is, you discover that the ground of meaning shifts all the time. Everybody's positions are different. Don't get me wrong, as a historian, I know that on December 7th, 1941, planes bombed Pearl Harbor. What Pearl Harbor meant to the people there and to the people who heard about it is very, very different. So every phenomena that we observe, gravity, right? We all see it from different perspectives. And in telling a story that is a creation, because I study culture, that is to say, I study the things that Americans made and believed, I'm interested in why they would choose to honor a story about, in this case, a working person who gives his life for innocence and reaches out to other people who are vulnerable. There are plenty of real stories that do the same thing, but as we all know, there's a lot of unsung heroes in the world. So it's not like I'm trying to perpetuate a myth or a lie. What I'm trying to do in this particular case is an illustration. we have dozens and dozens, hundreds of these kinds of stories, and they're just another part of our cultural heritage. The same way that the Lindy Hop is a part of our cultural heritage, or fried apple pies, or whatever. So it's not their lack of factualness that's important. It's the fact that people believe them. In my own work, just very quickly, in my own work on the history of rock and soul music, I spent a lot of time in Memphis and the Mississippi Delta. And everywhere I traveled in my Smithsonian gig around the country, folks would ask me, so did so-and-so steal rock and roll from someplace else? And my answer was, well, if what you're saying is, did somebody copy someone else? Sure, everybody draws inspiration. And in many cases, I'd be asked this explicitly about Elvis. I never mentioned Elvis Presley's name once, and I would always get asked this. And I would say, well, the facts are that Elvis continually throughout his life, from the 1950s when he first came up to the time he died, said that his music came from the African American tradition, especially that he grew up listening to and steeped in. But the fact that people believed that it was theft spoke fairly and honestly to a greater history of economic unfairness and injustices that took place. It does Elvis or no one else any harm to both say what he said, that in fact he acknowledged his own indebtedness even as he did his own thing, and to acknowledge the greater histories of economic injustice that meant that at least Elvis wound up being able to keep the money he made, whereas lots of other artists who were unschooled and unlettered did not. So that's why you honor the things that aren't true as well as the things that are. Is that all? Maybe.
It's somewhat.
Reasonable minds.
I wanted it to be true.
Oh.
I wanted it to be true so bad.
There you go. Fair enough. Fair enough.
Anyone else?
I have a question. Do you think that I'm just thrilled to hear your stories, and do you think that there's any hope for these kind of stories to be integrated into the history that's taught to children that are coming up? The history books that our children have seem to be absolutely horrible, fact-based, not even factual in some cases. And yet I see that these stories that you're talking about are what are really important in life, not just to learn the facts. And I just wonder how we can do this, how we can integrate these stories. Is there hope to ever get these stories into our children's education and get them away from the SOL theory of history?
I'm pretty hopeful about that because I see it happening. Through the foundation, for example, we see grants all the time for teacher institutes. There's things that we're involved in that we're calling content academies, for example, where where teachers are taught, like in Arlington, for example, that there's this African American community there, and it hasn't, it's not, people. There's I think part of what we're talking about is privileging written history over oral history. So if it's written, that's okay. It's in the newspaper, that's true. This is just what people told each other. But of course we know that that's a very power-laden thing, that there are certain people that just aren't in the books, or they're taught or they're spoken of in a very simple way, Indians were savages, or, these types of things. So I know there's a lot that's happened. It's a lot better. The textbooks that I see are getting better, and that there's these content academies or teacher workshops where they're showing teachers, okay, the story of Virginia Indians is not Pocahontas, period, and that these people actually, believe it or not, live here now, and this is their culture. And so I think there's a lot to it. I mean, this SOLs that you're talking about and just schools in general. I used to be an elementary school teacher, and I've seen that's the job I don't know if I'd want to do now, because teachers are given so much less freedom, so much pressure about standardized testing and stuff. But I can also say that it's not too difficult to get around. The SOLs are quite broad, actually. And you can very easily say, well, this responds to 102C. Students will learn about their, it can be done, and I think it's getting better. There's a long way to go, but that's just I'm more optimistic, I guess.
Do you think that we should start with contacting teachers, and that's the way that we bring the stories that we've?
It's great. I mean, I'll let you all talk about it. I'll just speak for the foundation. Tends to be more inclined to support teacher training. The idea being simply that you train them and then you reach it. So rather than a program, we do direct programs to children too, but the hope is that if you can get a teacher to understand this and give them the teacher the tools and the lens, then it reaches. It's more impactful that way. But I've been involved in a lot of programs of bringing, for example, traditional artists into schools. So we just did a program where we paired a bluegrass banjo player together with an West African Ngoni player to let people know, you wouldn't think this, but the banjo actually comes from Africa, and what are the implications of that? I think there's a lot out there and a lot that could be done, and but hopefully teachers are given. It's tough. They're not given a lot of freedom. I don't know if you guys.
Well, I make it a point during the semester when I have education majors in my classes. At the end of the semester, I kind of make my little farewell address or whatever, and I say, those of you who are going into the classroom, remember, some of the things you've heard here, but keep looking for some of those things too, because education majors, you don't have to take. Most of the classes I teach would be an elective. You don't have to take women's history or Native American history or African American history. And so you can actually be get into the classroom and not have any experience with those things. So the students who actually choose to take classes with me, I really encourage them to make sure they take that into their classroom. And what's really neat is that one of them, he graduated in 2009. Every semester he writes me, tells me what, this is what we're doing, So at least I know there's one person out there trying to get a diverse history into the classroom. But I do think, like John is saying, you have to start with the teachers. And I think that's where it is.
But you also have to let the school board officials and the elected officials say, enough with the speed up. This is like Charlie Chaplin in The Factory. I won't go too much. And what do you want for your children? If you want them to know stuff, then go ahead and give them tests every 2 days. If you want them to think, and there's something to be said for that, because the compact in which you get to work a job and stay at it for 3 decades is gone. The people who make the jobs don't have that system anymore. So if you get trained to do X, you ain't going to be doing X for 3 decades. Sorry, this really gets my goat. But I also have 2 children, So you got to yell and scream at the people who are using tests to get in to substitute for actually hiring teachers and giving them a chance to develop their curriculums and not be teaching 6 out of 7 periods or 7 periods out of 7 periods. If you run your school like a factory, you're going to have people who can do nothing but this. We don't have that economy anymore. All hard work is valuable, but that isn't what we want for our children. Or if maybe we do, we got to have that talk.
I know y'all don't want to get between undergraduate students and pizza. We actually have to cut it a little short, but can we maybe congregate? Oh, we have one. Okay. Yeah. Oh, I'm sorry, ma'am. You want to talk now?
And I think what is important, though, is that we are capturing these stories. I think the difference between the oral history project, like what will be happening in the next couple of days, and some that have happened in the past, is that the entire story was not captured. It was done in pieces and parts. And so when we actually capture the story, have someone sit down and tell it, and we capture it on video, we capture it, transcribe it down into a written form, then it becomes a document. It becomes an oral document, it becomes a written document, and we can reference it. It can be shared with others, and so that story then becomes more than just a myth. It becomes something that can be taken back and referenced by a variety of people. And so that can be added to what's in a museum. I'm coming from a museum, and I use that on the floor of the museum to share with the object. And because this brings the event alive, when you can hear someone's actual words of how they experienced it, it makes that so much more interesting to children, to the next generation, to the older generation, to our generation, when they can actually see, hear about it, taste, feel what it tasted like, what it sounded like, what it felt like to be there at that historic event. Even if the historic event was everyday life in Middlesex County, it just brings it so much more alive. So I applaud this oral history project because it is helping people to understand the past, like you mentioned in the beginning, but because we're capturing a whole side of it that hasn't been recorded.
I would just add, though, that, to maybe, we're in an amazing time right now with digital technology to reach incredible audience, unbelievable, the tools that are out there, free tools that are out there. And that I would try to move away from the thinking of, okay, we'll get this text, we'll record this story and then we will transcribe it, and now it is text, which you can access maybe here or in the Historical Society or the museum, and that there are really inexpensive technologies out there, including people's phones at this point, where you can capture a voice. Yes, you can transcribe it, but also people can hear that voice, and they can hear it on SoundCloud, and they can access it, and it could be linked everywhere. I think that a video now, it's not what it used to be. I mean, it's amazing. So I think it's important we all utilize that and not move from just the idea of we're going to transcribe this and now somebody can read it in a document form. Do you know what I'm saying?
I do. I think the voice is very powerful. I totally agree. But one thing that's nice about the written is it does move forward in time. It's something that was written in the 1600s now, even though some extent technology has changed. So that is one aspect of it. We can figure out how to take that and move it forward with just the video and oral part of it. I think that would be excellent. But that is an unknown at this point now. But I think capturing the story is exactly what's important.
All right, y'all. Thank you so much again. We hope to see you.